Welcome to Stairway to English. In this video, we will explore the dramatic story of the Titanic in English. Listen, read, and practice with us. If you enjoy this video, please like and leave a comment to support the channel. Episode 1: The Birth of the Titanic. The story of the Titanic is one of the most famous and tragic stories in modern history. It is a story about dreams, human progress, pride, mistakes, and loss. People around the world know about the Titanic not only because it was a great ship, but also because of the dramatic events that happened on its first and only voyage. In this series, we will explore the full story of the Titanic, from its creation to its tragic end, and the lessons it left for humanity. The Titanic was not just another ship. It was built to be the largest and most luxurious passenger liner in the world. In the early 1900s, the competition between shipping companies was very strong. Wealthy passengers wanted comfort and safety when they traveled across the Atlantic Ocean. The White Star Line, a famous company, wanted to build ships that were larger, stronger, and more comfortable than any other ships at the time. They planned 3 huge ships: the Olympic, the Titanic, and the Britannic. The Titanic was built in Belfast, Ireland, at the Harland and Wolff shipyard. Thousands of workers spent more than 2 years building it. The ship was massive, with a length of about 269 meters and a height equal to an 11-story building. People at the time were amazed by its size and beauty. The Titanic was described as unsinkable because of its modern design and advanced safety features. Many people believe that it represented the highest level of technology and human achievement. Inside, the Titanic was like a floating palace. First-class passengers enjoyed luxury like never before. There were elegant dining rooms, grand staircases, smoking rooms, and even a swimming pool, which was very rare at the time. The rooms were decorated with fine furniture, expensive carpets, and beautiful art. Wealthy passengers could travel across the Atlantic Ocean in comfort and style. Second-class passengers also had good accommodations, much better than what was available on other ships at the time. Even third-class passengers, who are usually poor immigrants traveling to America, had cleaner and more comfortable rooms than they would find on most ships of the time. The Titanic had space for more than 2,000 passengers and a crew of around 900 people. It had modern equipment, such as wireless telegraphs, which allowed messages to be sent across long distances. The ship also had strong steel doors that could close in case of flooding. Because of these features, many believed that the Titanic was safe against almost any accident. Newspapers called it the unsinkable ship, and people trusted that nothing bad could happen to it. The Titanic's maiden voyage was planned for April 1912. It was to travel from Southampton, England, to New York City in the United States. The journey was very important for the White Star Line. They wanted to show the world that their ship was the best and the safest. Many wealthy and famous people booked tickets for this historic trip. Among them were businessmen, aristocrats, and celebrities. At the same time, many poor families bought third-class tickets because they wanted to start a new life in America. For them, the Titanic represented hope and opportunity. On April 10, 1912, the Titanic left Southampton. Thousands of people came to watch the departure of the giant ship. The weather was clear and the sea was calm. The passengers were excited, and many believed that this was the safest and most comfortable journey they could ever experience. The ship first stopped at Cherbourg in France, and then at Queenstown, now Cove, in Ireland, to pick up more passengers. After that, it began its long journey across the Atlantic Ocean toward New York City. During the first days of the voyage, everything seemed perfect. The passengers enjoyed the luxury, the food, and the entertainment. The first-class passengers walked on the wide decks, socialized in the lounges, and enjoyed concerts. The second-class passengers wrote letters to their families and joined in friendly conversations. The third-class passengers played music, sang songs, and dreamed about their new lives in America. Everyone on board felt safe and happy, and many believed they were part of something historic. However, beneath the excitement and beauty, there were also small signs of risk. The Titanic carried only about 20 lifeboats, which was enough for just over half of the people on board. At the time, the law required fewer lifeboats, and the ship's designers thought that too many lifeboats would make the deck look crowded and unattractive. Nobody imagined that a ship as powerful as the Titanic would ever need to use all of its lifeboats. The Titanic was also traveling fast. The ship's crew wanted to make a record by crossing the Atlantic quickly. Captain Edward Smith, who was one of the most experienced captains of the White Star Line, was in charge. He believed in the strength of the ship and the safety of the voyage. But some crew members and experts warned that there were icebergs in the North Atlantic at that time of year. Icebergs could be dangerous even for large ships. Despite the warnings, the Titanic continued to sail forward at high speed. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic disasters in history. The passengers, unaware of the danger ahead, continued to enjoy the trip. They laughed, ate, danced, and dreamed of what awaited them in New York. Nobody could imagine that within a few days, the Titanic would become a symbol of tragedy, a lesson about human pride, and a story that the world would never forget. Episode 2: The Titanic Meets the Iceberg. The second part of the Titanic story is about the most dramatic and unforgettable moment of the voyage. It is the night when the unsinkable ship struck an iceberg in the cold waters of the North Atlantic. This moment changed everything, turning a dream voyage into one of the greatest tragedies in modern history. The Titanic had been at sea for 4 days. The passengers were still enjoying their journey. The weather was calm and the ocean was clear. People walked on the deck, relaxed in their rooms, and enjoyed meals in the beautiful dining rooms. Nobody imagined danger, but the ship was sailing through waters where icebergs were common, especially in April. Several warnings about icebergs had been sent to the Titanic by wireless telegraph from other ships. Some ships ahead had already reported large ice fields in the area. The Titanic's wireless operators received these warnings. However, they were also busy sending personal messages for the passengers because many wealthy people wanted to contact their families or business partners. Some warnings were delivered to the captain, but others were not treated with enough seriousness. The crew believed that the Titanic was strong enough to survive any collision. On the night of April 14th, the sea was unusually calm. There was no moon and the water was like glass. This made it harder to see icebergs because there were no waves breaking against them. The lookouts, who were watching from the crow's nest, did not have binoculars, which made the job even more difficult. Still, The Titanic continued at a speed of about 22 knots, very close to its maximum. At 11:40 p.m., one of the lookouts, Frederick Fleet, suddenly saw a huge iceberg directly ahead of the ship. He rang the warning bell 3 times and called the bridge with the message, "Iceberg right ahead." The officers reacted quickly. First Officer William Murdoch ordered the ship to turn sharply to the left and the engines to be reversed. The crew tried their best to avoid the collision. The Titanic began to turn, but it was too late. Only seconds later, the starboard side of the ship scraped against the iceberg. The sound was not very loud, and many passengers did not notice it at first. They thought it was just a small shake. Some even continued their games and conversations, unaware of the danger. But below the surface, the iceberg had torn open several of the ship's compartments. The Titanic's design allowed it to float with up to 4 compartments flooded, but the iceberg had damaged 5 compartments. Water began to rush in quickly. The ship's builders had said it was unsinkable, but now the truth was clear. The Titanic was in serious danger. Captain Edward Smith was informed immediately. He ordered a full inspection. Within a short time, the ship's designer, Thomas Andrews, who was on board for the maiden voyage, realized the terrible truth. He told the captain that the ship could not stay afloat. The damage was too great, and the Titanic had only a few hours before it would sink completely. The crew began to prepare the lifeboats, but there were only 20 of them, not nearly enough for all the people on board. The ship carried more than 2,200 passengers and crew, but the lifeboats could carry only about 1,200. This was a tragic mistake. At that moment, most people on the ship still did not believe they were in danger. They thought the Titanic was too strong to sink. Some passengers even refused to get into the lifeboats because they felt safer on the big ship than in the small boats on the dark ocean. As time passed, the truth became clear. The bow of the ship was sinking deeper into the water. The tilt became noticeable. Passengers began to panic. The crew tried to keep order, but it was difficult. The first lifeboats left with only half of their seats filled because many passengers did not want to leave. This meant that many lives were lost unnecessarily. The rich and powerful were not given automatic preference, but the rule "women and children first" was followed in most cases. Many husbands said goodbye to their wives and children, knowing they would not survive. Some families were separated forever that night. The wireless operators Jack Phillips and Harold Bride sent out desperate calls for help. They used the new distress signal SOS as well as the older signal CQD. Several ships heard the messages, but most were too far away to arrive quickly. The nearest ship, the Carpathia, was more than 3 hours away. Another ship, the Californian, was closer but did not respond in time, possibly because its wireless operator was asleep. As the water continued to flood the ship, the situation grew worse. Musicians on board decided to play music to calm the passengers. They performed on the deck while the lifeboats were being lowered. Many survivors later said that the music gave them comfort in the middle of chaos. By midnight, panic had spread. Passengers in third class had difficulty reaching the lifeboats because of confusion and locked gates. Crew members tried to help, but there was not enough time. The lifeboats filled with more women and children, while many men stood back, waiting for their fate. The Titanic, once called the safest ship in the world, was now fighting a hopeless battle against the sea. Within a short time, the bow sank even deeper and the stern lifted higher into the air. People began to realize that the end was near. The night of April 14th, 1912, turned into the early morning of April 15th with fear, courage, and heartbreaking decisions. The Titanic, which had started its journey with pride and joy, was now facing its destiny in the dark, icy waters of the Atlantic Ocean. Episode 3: The Night of Fear and Courage. The night of April 14th to April 15th, 1912, was one of the darkest nights in history. The Titanic had struck the iceberg at 11:40 p.m., and now water was pouring into the ship's compartments. The great vessel that people called unsinkable was slowly going down. But what made the story so dramatic were not only the ship's problems, but also the human stories of fear, bravery, sacrifice, and tragedy that unfolded in those last hours. When the iceberg ripped open the Titanic's side, the passengers did not immediately understand the seriousness of the situation. In first class, people felt only a small vibration. Some even joked about it. Others continued their card games, drinks, and conversations. In second class, people were curious but not worried. In third class, some passengers noticed water already entering lower cabins, and they began to feel real fear. Captain Edward Smith and Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, quickly realized that the Titanic was doomed. Andrews said the damage was too great. The ship might last an hour or two, but not more. Captain Smith knew he had to save as many lives as possible, even though there were not enough lifeboats for everyone. The crew began to wake up passengers and bring them to the boat deck, but many passengers were confused. They were told to put on life jackets, but they did not want to leave their warm rooms for the cold night. The Titanic was still standing strong, and it did not look like it would sink soon. Many people thought it was safer to stay on the ship. The first lifeboats were lowered just after midnight. Sadly, many of them were not full. Lifeboat number 7 left with only 28 people, although it could carry 65. This happened again and again. Passengers were hesitant, and the crew did not want to wait. They feared the ship might sink suddenly, and they wanted to move quickly. This mistake would cost many lives later. On the deck, the rule of women and children first was followed. Husbands kissed their wives and children goodbye, promising they would meet again. Many never did. Wealthy men like John Jacob Astor, one of the richest men in the world, stayed behind after helping his young, pregnant wife into a lifeboat. Other men tried to sneak into boats, but in most cases, they were sent back. The musicians of the Titanic showed great courage. Instead of trying to save themselves, they gathered on the deck and played music to calm the passengers. Survivors later remember hearing hymns and waltzes as they boarded the lifeboats. The music gave people hope, even as the situation grew worse. As the bow of the ship sank lower, fear spread. Some third-class passengers were trapped below because the gates separating classes were locked. The crew eventually opened some of them, but by then it was too late for many. People tried to climb up, carrying their children, desperate to reach the lifeboats. Chaos grew stronger with every passing minute. By 1:30 a.m., the Titanic's tilt was obvious. Passengers could no longer deny the truth. The ship was going down, and only the lifeboats could save them. But most of the lifeboats had already been lowered. The remaining passengers crowded the deck, searching for any chance of survival. Wireless operators Jack Phillips and Harold Bride continued to send desperate SOS signals. Their hands were frozen, but they refused to stop. Their bravery meant that the Carpathia, a ship about 60 miles away, began rushing toward them at full speed. However, the Carpathia would not arrive in time to save everyone. Some crew members and passengers showed incredible bravery. Second Officer Charles Lightoller worked hard to organize the evacuation. He forced men back, insisting that women and children go first. He later survived by clinging to an overturned lifeboat. The ship's designer, Thomas Andrews, was last seen helping passengers, giving out life jackets, and guiding people toward safety. He did not survive. The stories of sacrifice were many. Isidore and Ida Strauss, an elderly couple who owned a department store in New York, refused to be separated. Ida gave up her place on a lifeboat to stay with her husband. They sat together on the deck, holding hands until the end. Stories like theirs became symbols of love and loyalty. As the minutes passed, the stern of the ship rose higher into the air. People began to slip on the deck as it tilted more and more. Some jumped into the freezing water, hoping to reach lifeboats. The water temperature was around -2 degrees Celsius, 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Nobody could survive for long in such cold. At around 2 a.m., only a few lifeboats were left. Officers tried to load them quickly, but the crowd was panicked. Shots were fired into the air to control the situation. Some passengers prayed, others cried, and some stood silently, waiting for the end. By 2:15 a.m., the Titanic was nearly gone. The bow was completely underwater, and the stern rose almost straight up into the sky. Lights flickered and then went out. Survivors in the lifeboats watched in horror as the great ship broke into two pieces. A thunderous noise echoed across the ocean. The stern floated for a short time, then it too sank beneath the waves. The unsinkable ship had disappeared into the Atlantic. More than 1,500 people were left in the freezing water calling for help. Their cries filled the night, but only a few would be rescued. The lifeboats, half empty, stayed away at first, afraid of being pulled down by the desperate crowd. Slowly, the voices grew weaker and finally went silent. The Titanic, the pride of human progress, was gone. In just a few hours, a dream of luxury and safety had turned into one of the greatest tragedies of the sea. But for the survivors, the night of April 14th would never be forgotten. It was the night when fear, courage, love, and sacrifice were all written into history. Episode 4: The Rescue and the Aftermath. When the Titanic finally sank in the early morning of April 15th, 1912, more than 1,500 people were left in the freezing water. Most of them did not survive more than a few minutes. The cold sea was like ice, and it quickly took away their strength. Survivors in the lifeboats listened to the cries for help. The sounds of hundreds of voices filled the night, but slowly they became weaker and weaker until only silence remained. The lifeboats that had escaped the sinking ship were now floating in the dark ocean. Some were half empty, even though there had been space for more people. Passengers in the boats felt both relief and deep sadness. They had survived, but they had left behind husbands, wives, children, and friends. The night was filled with fear and sorrow. The nearest ship that heard the Titanic's SOS calls was the Carpathia. Captain Arthur Rostron of the Carpathia acted with great speed and courage. He turned his ship around immediately and ordered his crew to prepare for rescue. They made hot drinks, food, and blankets ready for survivors. But the Carpathia was still about 3 hours away from the Titanic's position. That meant it could not arrive before the Titanic went under. When the Carpathia reached the area at around 4 a.m., all that remained of the Titanic were lifeboats and floating debris. The sea was full of wooden pieces, furniture, and personal belongings. Bodies were also floating in the water, showing the scale of the tragedy. Survivors in the lifeboats waved and shouted when they saw the lights of the Carpathia. For them, it was a moment of hope after hours of despair. The Carpathia's crew began pulling survivors on board. One by one, cold and shocked passengers were lifted from the lifeboats. Some were crying, others were silent, and many were too weak to even speak. Children were carried into safety, and women were wrapped in warm blankets. Crew members and doctors worked without rest to comfort them. Survivors were given hot tea, soup, and medical attention. In total, around 705 people were saved by the Carpathia, but for each person saved, more than twice as many had been lost. The survivors could not forget the sounds of the people who had drowned, and many would remember those cries for the rest of their lives. Life on board the Carpathia during the rescue was filled with sorrow. Survivors searched for loved ones, calling names and asking questions. Some families were reunited, but many others discovered that their husbands, wives, children were gone forever. The atmosphere was heavy with grief. Captain Rostron of the Carpathia sent messages to New York, informing the world about the disaster. At first, newspapers printed confused reports. Some even said that all passengers had been saved. But as the Carpathia continued its journey to New York with the survivors, the terrible truth became clear. The Titanic was gone, and more than 1,500 lives had been lost. When the Carpathia arrived in New York on April 18th, thousands of people were waiting at the docks. Families of passengers were desperate for news. Some waited with hope, while others feared the worst. Survivors walked off the ship in shock, carrying nothing but the clothes they had been wearing. Many were welcomed by relatives or by strangers offering help, but the pain of loss was everywhere. The tragedy shocked the entire world. People could not believe that such a modern, advanced ship had sunk on its first voyage. The Titanic had been called unsinkable, yet it had gone down in less than 3 hours after hitting the iceberg. The disaster became front-page news in every country. Governments quickly began to investigate what went wrong. In both the United States and Britain, official inquiries were held. Survivors, crew members, and shipbuilders were questioned. They explained that there had been not enough lifeboats for everyone, that warnings about icebergs had been ignored, and that the ship had been traveling too fast in dangerous waters. The inquiries led to many changes in safety laws. After the Titanic, all passenger ships were required to carry enough lifeboats for every person on board. Lifeboat drills became mandatory, so passengers would know what to do in an emergency. Ships also had to keep their wireless radios active 24 hours a day to make sure that no distress calls would ever be missed again. An international ice patrol was also created to monitor dangerous icebergs in the North Atlantic. The Titanic's sinking was not only a tragedy, but also a turning point in maritime history. It forced people to recognize that no ship, no matter how advanced, was completely safe. Human mistakes and pride had contributed to the disaster, and the world had to learn from it. For the survivors, the aftermath was full of challenges. Many had lost family members, friends, or their life savings since they were traveling to start new lives in America. Wealthy passengers who survived sometimes faced criticism, while poor immigrants struggled to rebuild their dreams. Some survivors suffered trauma and nightmares for the rest of their lives. Yet, Even in the face of such sadness, there were stories of kindness and hope. In New York and other cities, people donated money, food, and clothes to help the survivors. Charities raised funds for families who had lost loved ones. Around the world, people mourned together, united by the shared shock of the Titanic disaster. The image of the great ship sinking into the icy Atlantic became a powerful symbol. It reminded people of the limits of human power and the unpredictability of nature. The Titanic story was not only about a ship, it was about people, about dreams, about mistakes, and about courage. The world would never forget what happened on that cold April night in 1912. The Titanic's tragedy lived on in memories, in lessons, and in the hearts of those who survived. Episode 5: The Legacy of the Titanic. The sinking of the Titanic was more than just a shipwreck. It became a story that shaped history, culture, and human understanding of safety at sea. Even more than 100 years later, people still talk about the Titanic, read about it, and make films and books about it. It is not only a story of tragedy, but also a story of lessons, memories, and human courage. After the disaster, the world was deeply shaken. Newspapers in every country wrote long reports about the loss of the great ship. People cried for the victims they had never met because the Titanic symbolized both hope and heartbreak. The ship had carried some of the richest and most powerful people in the world, as well as poor immigrants who dreamed of a new life in America. Its story touched everyone because it showed that tragedy does not choose between rich and poor. The Titanic also became a symbol of human pride. Before the voyage, people said that the ship was unsinkable. Engineers and the press celebrated it as the strongest and most advanced creation of modern technology. But the Iceberg proved them wrong. Nature showed its power, and humanity had to accept that nothing is truly indestructible. The Titanic reminded the world that humility is important, even in times of great progress. One of the most lasting results of the disaster was the change in safety regulations. As we saw earlier, new rules were made for lifeboats, radio communication, and iceberg patrols. Thanks to these rules, sea travel became much safer. Many lives were saved in later years because of the lessons learned from the Titanic. In this way, the victims did not die in vain. Their tragedy helped protect future generations. The Titanic also left behind personal stories that inspired the world. People remembered the musicians who played music until the very end, trying to bring comfort to others. They remembered Captain Edward Smith, who stayed on the bridge and went down with his ship. They remembered brave crew members who worked to save as many passengers as possible. They remembered families like the Strausses, who chose to stay together rather than be separated. These stories became examples of love, duty, and courage. Over the years, the Titanic became more than history. It became a legend. Writers, poets, and artists created works inspired by it. In 1958, a famous film called A Night to Remember was released, showing the disaster in detail. In 1997, another film, Titanic by James Cameron, became one of the most successful movies of all time. It told the story of the tragedy through a mix of fiction and real events. Millions of people around the world learned about the Titanic through that movie. The ship's story became part of global culture. Explorers also became interested in the Titanic. For many years, nobody knew exactly where it had sunk. In 1985, a team led by Robert Ballard discovered the wreck at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, more than 3,800 meters below the surface. Pictures of the ship's remains shocked the world. Even after decades underwater, parts of the Titanic were still recognizable. The grand staircase, the windows, and the broken hull. It was a sad but powerful reminder of the disaster. Today, museums around the world show artifacts recovered from the wreck. Pieces of furniture, clothing, jewelry, and even letters. These objects connect us to the people who lived and died on the ship. Walking through such exhibitions makes the story real. Visitors understand that the Titanic was not just a ship, but a place full of human lives and dreams. For English learners and for people everywhere, the Titanic is a story with many lessons. It teaches us about technology, history, and the human spirit. It shows us the dangers of arrogance and the importance of preparation. It reminds us that even in the darkest times, people can show kindness, courage, and love. The Titanic's legacy is not only about loss, it is also about memory and respect. Each year, people still hold ceremonies on April 15th to honor those who died. Survivors are gone now, but their stories remain alive. Families of victims and historians keep their memories alive, making sure the world never forgets. More than a century later, the Titanic still captures the imagination. Books are written, documentaries are made, and people continue to visit exhibitions. Children learn about it in school, and adults talk about it when they think about history's greatest tragedies. The Titanic has become a timeless story that belongs to everyone. In the end, the Titanic was more than a ship. It was a dream, a warning, and a legend. It carried the hopes of thousands, and its loss changed the world forever. The story of the Titanic shows us that life is fragile, that mistakes can be costly, and that courage shines brightest in the darkest hours. That is why, even today, the Titanic is remembered not only as a tragedy, but also as a symbol of humanity's strength and weakness.